Well, then is China fully out of the problem? Not quite. And this is where the real problem is. If you look at the Chinese flow of funds data, which is exactly the same data as the Japanese one, you notice that the Chinese companies actually stopped borrowing money 5 years before the bubble burst, starting from here, 2016, and then start reducing their borrowings. And because the household sector is still saving money, and the companies stopped borrowing money, the government had to come in to save the Chinese economy. So this green line is the government. This is all happening before the bubble burst. And this is very, very disturbing. Why? Because China is at that stage of economic development where the companies should be busy borrowing money and expanding their production systems. I mean, we know Chinese are very entrepreneurial. They have lots of technology. They're coming up with lots of innovative products, very interesting products. And they're still very competitive even with the higher wages that they have to pay. Because you can see from their export numbers, right? Still very, very competitive economy. And so if you're a Chinese entrepreneur with a factory to produce these newer products, they should be borrowing money and investing, expanding. And then you see that that's not happening. They're actually not borrowing money. I wonder why that is the case. Is it because of these conflict with the United States and Western markets may not be open? I don't know what are the reasons they start borrowing money, but that forced Chinese government to actually borrow a lot to keep the Chinese economy going. So even before the bubble burst, starting from 2016, Chinese economy was actually supported by fiscal stimulus of the Chinese government, mostly regional governments. But what that means is that by now, as all of you are aware, Chinese regional governments are in very sad shape. They basically exhausted their borrowing capacity. People are very afraid of lending money to regional governments now. But from this point, they have to fight balance sheet recession. So this number has to go much further because this number is likely to go this way. And that's going to be a huge challenge for the Chinese economy and for the fiscal authority. My guess is that regional governments probably won't be able to handle it. So the central government has to come in and either help the regional governments or do the fiscal stimulus by themselves. Because the regional governments on their own probably cannot do any more fiscal stimulus, given how much debt they already are carrying. And so that's going to be a big challenge on the fiscal side. And furthermore, when Japanese bubble burst, the construction was about 20% of Japan's GDP. And it was already on a declining trend. So when Japanese bubble burst, the Japanese bubble was the prices went high and came crashing down. Not much impact on the construction. But in the Chinese case, there was a huge construction boom. And now the construction industry is frozen. But that's 26% of China's GDP. If construction is reduced by even by 10%, China will lose 2.6% of its GDP. So in addition to balance sheet recession driven by balance sheet problems, they have this construction recession that they have to address with more fiscal stimulus as well. And of course, this decoupling or de-risking, the West composed of about 55% of global GDP, and they are the per capita GDP of the West on average is $60,000. So all the rich customers are there. If decoupling means you are losing access to this market and you're only left with that one, the non-West is about 27% of global GDP, but per capita GDP is only 14,000. So you lose your best customers, the richest customers, and you're stuck with the poor ones. Maybe that's why Chinese companies don't want to invest. Because if you invest the factories, invest the production, and then you suddenly you lose your market in those economies, then you'll be stuck with this overcapacity. And finally, the population. As most of you are aware, Chinese population started declining this year or last year. And many of you have heard this argument that, oh, Japan is doing so poorly because demographics are so bad. The population is shrinking. That argument, in my view, is nonsense. Because Japanese population peaked in 2009. Japanese bubble burst 1990. So there was 19 years where Japanese population was growing. So you cannot explain the Japanese deflation during that 19 years because Japanese population was still growing. It's only after 2009 that Japanese population starts shrinking. But in the Chinese case, the bursting of the bubble and the population shrinking happening on the same year. So this is going to be quite a bit of challenge for the Chinese policymakers, because even though population itself doesn't affect the economy all that drastically right away, people's mind for investments will be affected. When people start thinking that, wow, population is shrinking, the markets will be shrinking, then let's put the production somewhere else instead of at home. People start thinking like that. And so even though population doesn't affect the economy right away, it could still affect the investment side of it, and that could affect the economy eventually. So let me skip that part. So if I compare what Japan faced back in 1990 and China this time, Japan had a bursting of the bubble and the balance sheet recession. That was bad enough. And then at the time, Japan and the US had quite a bit of trade friction. It was very ugly trade friction. I was involved in it myself on the American side. But that was just within the businesses. Japanese markets were largely closed at that time. Americans wanted to sell more semiconductors and other things to the Japanese market. And Japanese said, no, we don't want it. It's the opposite of the Chinese issue. Americans are saying, no, you cannot buy our semiconductor. And back then, Americans are saying, Japanese, you buy our semiconductor. Well, that was the trade friction back then. But basically, just those two, because population was still growing and so forth. The Chinese are facing this many problems. Bursting of the asset price bubble and the balance sheet recession, that is one area where China can handle it quite easily because they already know the disease, they all know how to handle it. But then there's a construction recession in addition to it. And then, of course, Chinese companies are not borrowing money, so government was already running large deficits before that, not the central government, but the regional governments. And that has depleted the regional government's borrowing capacity quite a bit. And then, of course, this geopolitical problem with the West, this may be the one that's affecting all the other ones. And then middle income trap. China is in the middle of middle income trap in that when you're the lowest cost producer, all the factories from around the world will come to you. But once your cost becomes much higher, all these factories will then start moving away from you to Vietnam, Indonesia, and places like that. And it's not just the foreign companies. Chinese companies may move that too. Looks like a lot of Chinese policymakers have forgotten that they are in the middle income trap, because whenever Americans come up with some sort of sanctions against China, Chinese immediately come up with their own sanctions, right? And they keep on adding sanctions to each other. But it's China that's in the middle income trap. And if you do all these sanctions, less and less people will invest in China. Whereas, US is not affected because US is already out of the middle income trap. But somehow, no one is telling Mr. Xi Jinping that, look, we are in the middle income trap. We shouldn't do these sanctions so easily. But anyway, and then these regulatory uncertainties on so many areas, tech industry, financial industry, real estate industry, education sectors. Suddenly, government comes up with these regulations and all your investments worth nothing next day. If you do a few of these, of course, businessmen will become very, very cautious. If you have 5 ideas, maybe you do only 2. The 3 never shows up because only in the heads of these businessmen, but it will affect the economic growth going forward. And of course, population. And finally, And this one, I have no evidence to prove it myself, but during the COVID-19, a lot of governments provided a lot of help, financial help to the households and companies, at least in the developed world. In China, I hear that they didn't do very much of that, which means most businesses, many households had to weather the COVID-19 lockdowns by themselves. If that's the case, they must have depleted their savings during the period. And now that the economy is back, people can work. If all these Chinese households and companies decided that, wow, now we have to rebuild our savings. And if they all start rebuilding their savings to the level they had before, that's another balance sheet recession, but on the asset side. Now, the earlier balance sheet recession I talked about is on the liability side. The liability is too big, so they have to compress it. Now, on this one, the savings are too low. They want to rebuild it. So it's on the asset side, but the net effect on the economy will be the same, that everybody's saving money is no one borrowing money. I don't know how much of that is actually happening, but if, as we hear, that people are paying down debt, trying to save money, is coming from that reason, then that's another challenge for the Chinese policymakers. So you put all these things together, I must say that even though China has certain advantages over the Japanese back 30 years ago, taken together, I would say the challenge Chinese policymakers facing is far bigger than the challenge Japanese faced 30 years ago, which means Chinese economy is likely to slow down, even under the best of circumstances. And if they screw up any of these, it could slow down even more. So we're going to be facing the second largest economy in the world, our largest trading partner slowing down going forward, and we should be prepared for this kind of situation going forward. Thank you very much.